Hey everyone, welcome back to Kinder Everyday. This is a video about transgender people and why we as a society need to do a better job of caring for them. Let's just start with a Wikipedia definition so we're all on the same page. Transgender people have a gender identity or gender expression that differs from their sex assigned at birth. That is, when a baby is born, doctor's got to put something down on the birth certificate, so they pick it up, look at the genitals, tick a box. And because real life and human biology are very complicated, sometimes they get it wrong. That kind of sounds like a simple problem to fix. Unfortunately, that's not the case because of how gender roles are so ingrained into our society. Among other things, transgender people actually have it very difficult. Being trans, according to both recent research and anecdotal experiences from people I've personally heard from, is often extremely difficult. And we as a society can do better in supporting them. Quick disclaimer, I'm speaking in general terms. Transgender is kind of an umbrella word that includes a broad array of life experiences, and whether someone can be described as transgender is up to them. Also, for clarity, the term is often shortened to trans, which means the same thing. It's the same term, so just to save a few syllables. Transphobia, which is the discrimination against or fear of trans people, is receiving something of a resurgence in the UK, not that it ever necessarily went away. At the moment, there's been a bunch of crap flung around online, partly including a well-known children's fantasy author, who are being very loud about speaking out against trans people and trans people's rights. There was an attempt to push back against some proposed legislation in the UK that would improve access to medical care and public facilities for trans people. Fortunately, that didn't go through, but it was close. A lot of us wrote to our MPs to try and protect that. In my opinion, a lot of transphobia, alongside many other prejudices, includes an undercurrent of not understanding the thing people are afraid of. In this case, I don't think it's very commonly known why people transition or how difficult it is. And I think it's a very common kind of straw person transphobe argument that trans people are a danger to cisgendered women in particular. Cisgendered meaning people who aren't trans. It's just the opposite. There's a lot of panic about bathroom access, of all things. For the record, I haven't been able to find any data stating that cis people are at greater risk from trans people than other cis people. So I think generally there isn't anything to back up this fear, but it is resoundingly common. And so I wanted to talk about the research that has been done into the struggles that trans people face and why transitioning is important. I've also learned over time that transitioning is really hard. When I was younger, I was familiar with the concept of asex change as a surgery that you could have, right? I'd heard that term. And there are actually animals that change sex naturally as part of their growth. Like oysters, for instance. An oyster's sex is correlated with its age. My partner told me once that there's a species of animal where the animal's sex depends on how warm the eggs are when they hatch. I think it was a species of turtle or something. So, I didn't really realize how difficult it actually is, both socially and logistically. Transition surgery is very difficult. It takes a long time, years. It costs a lot of money if you're not getting it on the NHS. It can put you out of work for a long period of time while you're recovering. And there is often a lot of social discrimination that trans people experience, both over the course of their transition and in trying to get it in the first place, alongside long waiting lists. So as usual, I want these videos to be relatively data-driven rather than me telling you stuff I've learned off Twitter. So I did some research. My research focused on essentially the mental health problems that transgender people face as a result of discrimination and of the challenges of what's currently referred to as gender dysphoria, which is the distress caused by the disconnect between one's gender expression and their assigned sex. The most major study I found was a very, very comprehensive study from 2012 called the Scottish Trans Mental Health Study. This is reference number 1 in the description below. If you scroll down, you'll find a link. If you look at the study itself, it's a very big PDF, and there's a key findings section near the end, pages 87 to 90. It is worth reading through that. It's just basically a big dump of statistics about summarizing the experiences of trans people. The study itself interviewed a large cohort of transgender people about their experiences before, during, and after transition. So I'm just going to read out basically a few bits from this summary. There's a lot more in it, and again, I'd encourage you to read it yourself for like a more complete picture. It is difficult to get treatment. So in the first place, you can't just walk into your GP and say, "Hey, I want to transition, help me," and they don't give it to you on a plate. Quote, 62% of people that used a gender identity clinic services experienced one or more negative interactions, 63% in general mental health services, and 65% in general health services. For nearly 30% of respondents, a healthcare professional had refused to discuss a trans-related health concern, end quote. So there's pushback on transgender people from within the medical system itself, which is their only way of accessing treatment. Trans people experience significant discrimination. The summary goes into detail on types of discrimination that these people had faced. I'm not going to read it out now just because there's a lot of numbers and it can be harrowing. Like, I don't want to basically trigger anybody. So the details are on page 88, but they are very sobering. Again, content warning for that. Be a little careful. Descriptions of abuse and sexual assault. Suicidal ideation is common. Again, content warning for the next paragraph. Quote, the majority of participants, 84%, had thought about ending their lives at some point. 35% of participants overall had attempted suicide at least once, and 25% had attempted suicide more than once, end quote. So those are huge and harrowing numbers. That's far greater than the general population. Transitioning, so the actual treatment, goes a long way to address mental health problems, even though discrimination can work against that. Quote, 74% felt that their mental health had improved as a result of transitioning. The 5% who reported a decline in their mental health since transitioning felt that their issues related to a lack of appropriate support, losing family and loved ones, or for reasons which respondents felt were unrelated or not directly related to the transition. So, as we see, there's a huge problem and a clear solution. Life satisfaction also goes up after transitioning. Quote, 70% of the participants were more satisfied with their lives since transitioning, and only 2% were less satisfied. Those that were less satisfied after transitioning cited poor surgical outcome, loss of family, friends, and employment, everyday experiences of transphobia, and non-trans related reasons, end quote. So, no one in the study seems to have said that the transition in itself was bad for them, apart from people where the transition went poorly. There's some number of people had a poor surgical outcome. The actual technologies and surgeries used are improving all the time, so we should hopefully see this number go down in future. And the vast majority of people either felt that it hadn't increased or decreased life satisfaction, or had increased it. Transgender people pay a heavy cost in societal acceptance and standard, the opportunities that people would expect to get in society. But transitioning provides emotional benefits on top of protecting folks from mental health problems. Longish quote, 70% of respondents felt that they had lost or missed out on something as a result of being trans, transitioning, or expressing their gender identity. These included jobs and a career, money, reproduction, home, childhood and youth, sports and leisure opportunities, equality and respect, family life, relationships and dating, happiness, friendships, intimacy, social life, personal development, education, and qualifications. That is a whole bunch of stuff that people miss out on because of declaring themselves as transgender or transitioning. Quote, 81% of participants felt that they had gained something as a result of being trans, transitioning, or expressing their gender identity. These included confidence, new friends, improved or better quality relationships, community and a sense of belonging, self-expression and acceptance, knowledge and insight, happiness and contentment, resilience, and a future. So the empowerment involved in allowing people to express or address their gender identity is significant. It is important to allow people to be their real selves, both internally and publicly. There's a lot more. I've read out a long section of quotes here, but there's plenty more in the study, and it paints a very convincing picture. But rather than focusing on this one study, there's another study from the US that goes into basically very similar conclusions. They focused on suicide rates. So again, content warning for the following quote. The 2015 US Transgender Survey, USTS, which is the largest survey of transgender people in the US to date, found that 81.7% of respondents reported ever seriously thinking about suicide in their lifetimes, while 48.3% had done so in the past year. In regard to suicide attempts, 40.4% reported attempting suicide at some point in their lifetimes, and 7.3% reported attempting suicide in the past year. Again, those are very serious, very sobering statistics. I want to divert from this to offer kind of my conclusion from this, which is I think a lot of transphobia is focused on trans people having other goals in mind when transitioning. It's to exploit a system or to gain access to cis women in a vulnerable position. These statistics show that no, this is, transgender people need to transition. It is a very serious position to be in life, and these people deserve society's care. We as a society need to do more to protect and uplift trans people. There isn't like some ulterior motive. It just is very, very hard to be transgender. The study, 2015 US Transgender Survey, I should have said this is reference number 2 in the description. If you scroll down, there's a link. They also list out in the kind of conclusion section significant associations with raised or decreased risks of suicide. So things they associated with increased risk even compared to average participant in the study. Discrimination or mistreatment in education, employment, housing, healthcare, public accommodations, or law enforcement. Rejection by partners or children, rejection by religious communities, violence, including domestic violence, and detransitioning. So people who started transitioning and then went back also reported higher rates of suicidal thoughts. Association with lower risk, being kind of anonymously transgender, so other people not knowing, which is really sad. Supportive families, transitioning itself, so receiving treatment implied a lower risk of suicide, and living in a state, again this is from the US, a US state with a gender identity non-discrimination statute, i.e. legal protection from discrimination. All of these things improved transgender people's mental health, or at least in so much as you can infer that from suicide rates and risks. So again, the very clear picture being painted here. Mistreatment, discrimination, and misunderstanding vastly increased mental health risks, and understanding, care, and treatment vastly decreased mental health risks. Reference 3 is a kind of meta-study from Cornell University. They collected 55 studies between 1991 and June in 2017. So link number 3 in the description. Quote, we identified 55 studies that consist of primary research on this topic, of which 51, i.e. 93%, found that gender transition improves the overall well-being of transgender people, while 7% report mixed or null findings. We found no studies concluding that gender transition causes overall harm. That is, again, a stunning conclusion. Very, very firm. It is very, very important to allow transgender people to transition and to support them in that. They go on to list a number of key findings, again, similar to the Scottish mental health study, a little shorter. If you follow the link, you can see the full list. I'm just going to read out the first half of it, which I think paints, again, a very clear picture. So, 1, the scholarly literature makes clear that gender transition is effective in treating gender dysphoria and can significantly improve the well-being of transgender individuals. 2. Among the positive outcomes of gender transition and related medical treatments for transgender individuals are improved quality of life, greater relationship satisfaction, higher self-esteem and confidence, and reductions in anxiety, depression, suicidality, and substance use. 3. The positive impact of gender transition on transgender well-being has grown considerably in recent years as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. 4. Regrets following gender transition are extremely rare and have become even rarer as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. Pooling data from numerous studies demonstrates a regret rate ranging from 0.3% to 3.8%. Regrets are most likely to result from a lack of social support after transition or poor surgical outcomes using older techniques. End quote. So again, transition works, social support works, and is vital. The studies they surveyed also paint a picture of things improving over time, both from greater understanding from the general public and from better techniques. It's kind of common for another thing that transphobic arguments sometimes focus on is the idea of detransitioning. This is often used to paint a picture of like, well, you can't know for sure that someone means it when they say they're transgender or wants to transition, so we should this is often spun into like a protecting the children thing, which is I don't really have space to go into in this video, but there is a entire additional debate about transgender youth, basically people who are not old enough to give like legal medical consent for their own treatment, which is not necessarily a problem if their parents are knowledgeable and supportive of their needs, but that is often not the case. So according to these studies at least, detransitioning doesn't happen because people decide they're not trans. It's because the surgery was bungled or they've faced increased discrimination and essentially decided to hide themselves away, which is heartbreaking. And again, paints a very clear picture that like that argument is unempathetic or not understanding of the actual situation involved. I mentioned gender dysphoria in one of those quotes. I haven't defined that term yet, but oh, sorry, I did, didn't I? I went over it. This is the disconnect between, or the distress one feels at the disconnect between gender expression and assigned sex. The research on both the causes of this disconnect and even understanding of the condition itself is always is always expanding and changing. So reference number 4 in the description below is a link to an article from World Psychiatry in 2016 about the upcoming change to the medical classification of gender dysphoria. It's being renamed to gender incongruence in 2022 by the World Health Organization, and is being reclassified under sexual health instead of mental disorders. They're actually adding a sexual health section to this. There's this huge, basically, classification of all the medical conditions a person can potentially have, as understood by current medical science, called the ICD, and ICD-11 comes out in 2022. There's a summary of the link on Wikipedia, because the actual link itself is the World Psychiatry article is quite hard reading if you're not a medical professional, which I'm not. But there's a link to a Wikipedia section on the change, which summarizes it quite well. On top of that, I want to point out that there's a lot of misinformation around. So both for this article and for writing, I mentioned earlier, writing to my MP about the gender reform change that was being debated in the UK recently. There's a lot of misinformation around because there's not a ton of research into the experiences and needs of transgender people, especially relevant research. Basically anything older than about 2010 is probably nonsense, or at least should be treated with a very big grain of salt. Because awareness of and attitudes towards transgenderism have evolved and improved so much recently, there aren't a ton of studies that actually talk to transgender people, which is one of the biggest things you should look out for. If you just Google it, there's a bunch of articles like from often American websites that are like religiously motivated or discriminatory. Be careful with those. Try and restrain your searches to things like Google Scholar or other academic sources, and be aware of any papers that are, like I said, older or don't directly talk to trans people. There's one that was published in 2018 that was a survey of parents reporting on the internet that their kids had suddenly become gender dysphoric, which is like, there are some obvious problems with that idea, in that like the parents might just not have known previously that their kids were transgender at all, or the kids themselves had not understood how they were feeling, and so the parents are like, wait, what? No, this is nonsense, when they just weren't in possession of all the facts and may not have understood the condition themselves. On top of that, the study itself looked at a couple of websites, at least one of which I recognize as being a transphobic website from the UK. There was a correction published to the article in 2019 that basically a lot of people objected to the way it was done. But if you don't find the correction, you might take that at face value. So again, be aware of any studies that don't directly talk to trans people primarily, if you're doing your own research on this. Because, yeah, misunderstandings and transphobia are sadly kind of rampant. So, in conclusion of all of the above, the stated needs of transgender people have been consistently validated by recent research. Transitioning and the lives of transgender people are far more difficult than we would imagine as lay people, and providing empathy and proper care, both societally and legally, is vital. I personally believe that it is the morally correct thing to do anyway, but that is also heavily backed up by a variety of studies, and I firmly believe that we should be introducing legislation to protect transgender people and ensure they have fair and rapid access to medical care and mental health care. And I also believe that we as individuals in society should do better to support the trans people we happen to come across in our lives, and any of our friends who might express similar desires themselves, and to understand in general the needs of transgender people so that we can, put pressure in the right places, support organizations that themselves support trans people, and act with empathy and appreciation where we have the opportunity to display care. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Kinder Every Day, and I will see you next time.